Ruth Calloway did not move when Dora Pratt stood up in the barn hall and accepted the room's applause for the bread. She stood in the kitchen doorway, both hands at her sides, and she listened to it. The sound of 60 people clapping moved through the hall in the particular rolling wave that belongs to approval, warm, unstoppable. Not caring at all what had passed over on the way. Men who had driven 2 counties to attend. Women in their best traveling clothes. The county land agent and the minister and 4 members of the Cattlemen's Association board. 60 people who had eaten tonight the finest harvest feast Holt County had seen in a decade, and every dish on every table had come through Ruth Calloway's hands. Dora Pratt pressed one gloved hand to her heart and smiled at the room. Every loaf. 8 varieties. 40 loaves baked in 4 separate batches, beginning at 4 that morning, when the sky was still black and the stone hearth was cold, and she was the only living soul awake on the Harlan property. Honey wheat and sourdough, and dark rye, and soft dinner rolls, with a crackling crust, and 2 braided celebration loaves she had been planning since her 2nd week of September. Each one pressed on the bottom crust. Before it went into the oven, with the small tin stamp she carried in her apron pocket. A raised C, for Calloway. 40 loaves. Her flour. Her hours. Her grandmother's starter culture. Alive longer than she was. Ruth reached into her apron pocket and closed her fingers around the stamp. She did not move. She held it and she listened, and she did not make a sound. He was at the kitchen door at supper time. Not in it, just at it, standing in the frame, the way Thomas Harlan always stood in frames. Occupying the exact midpoint between being somewhere and not being somewhere, maintaining the option of retreat, she opened the back door, if that already sits somewhere in your chest. Stay with me, subscribe to this channel and follow Ruth's story all the way to its end. Because I promise you, the end is worth the wait. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far her story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The letter from the Harlan Ranch arrived on a Friday in late September, 2 days after the final notice from the Holt County Land Office arrived, informing Ruth Calloway that the remaining balance on the deed to the Calloway farm, $55.12, was due in full by the 1st of November, or the property would revert to the county trust. She read the land office letter standing at her kitchen table. She read the Harlan letter sitting down. Walter had been dead 2 years and 4 months. He had died on a Tuesday morning in February, of the lung sickness, which was the slow kind. The kind that gave you time to understand exactly what was coming, and not quite enough time to do anything about it. He died in the gray, early light, with Ruth's hand folded in both of his, and the smell of bread moving through the house. Because she had put a loaf on at midnight without being able to say exactly why. Only knowing that her hands needed the work when everything else had moved past the point where hands could help. He had left her 80 acres of Dakota Territory grassland, a solid 2-room house, a kitchen she had loved from the first morning she cooked in it, and $90 of debt that had seemed survivable in the autumn before he died and was not anymore. She sold the milk cows in March. She sold the plow horse in May and borrowed a neighbor's gelding for the spring turning. She worked the garden to its outermost limit all summer and put up everything it produced in long, careful rows along the cold cellar shelves. And she counted every dollar twice, and she took in mending, and sold bread to the mercantile and the minister's household, and 4 of the neighboring farms. And she had not wasted a single thing, and she had been as careful as she knew how to be. By September, it had only been enough to pay $35 of the $90. $55.12. Due in 33 days. After that the county took the property and Ruth Calloway became a widow without a farm. Which was a particular kind of nothing she had no intention of becoming. She was good at many things. Walter had always said she was good at more than she gave herself credit for. Which was the kind of generous claim a husband made that a wife mostly dismissed while he was living, and then turned over and over in her hands after he was gone. In the dark hours, wondering which parts of it had been true, she could sew, and she could read a land contract,
And she could doctor a sick animal well enough that 2 of her neighbors had started calling on her before the veterinarian. She had been managing the farm alone for more than 2 years. And she was still standing. But what Ruth Calloway was extraordinary at was bread.
She had known it since she was 8 years old in a sod house kitchen in eastern Nebraska, learning at her mother's elbow, who had learned from her mother before her, a woman who had crossed the Missouri in a covered wagon in 1847, with nothing but her sourdough starter wrapped in a damp cloth and her conviction that feeding people with care was the most honest labor a person could do on this earth. Ruth had learned to read dough the way other children learn to read print. She knew what the feel of a well-developed gluten told her under her hands. She knew the difference between a crumb that had been rushed and a crumb that had been given its proper time. She knew how to make bread from almost nothing and have it come out tasting like something. She knew a dozen kinds and she had opinions about all of them. She felt like every version of herself, all at once. The girl learning at her grandmother's elbow in a Nebraska sod house. The young wife baking for market with Walter at the table keeping the accounts. The widow with the leaking roof and the $55 and the tin bread stamp in her apron pocket going to a ranch kitchen because she had run out of alternatives and walked in through the back door and been told to stay invisible.
The woman who had been seen, anyway.
Her bread was known in Holt County the way certain things become known quietly. By word of mouth rather than advertisement. By the particular way people's voices changed when they mentioned it to someone who hadn't tried it yet. The minister's wife had told her 3 times in 3 separate conversations that the communion loaves Ruth donated to the church were the finest she had eaten in 30 years of church suppers, and she had eaten church suppers in 4 states. The proprietor of the Holt County Mercantile kept a standing order for 6 sourdough loaves a week. A cattleman from 2 towns west had driven an hour in each direction for 3 months running to buy her dark rye, and when Ruth finally asked him why he bothered making the trip, he had said simply that his mother used to make bread that tasted exactly like that and he hadn't found it anywhere else since she was gone.
She had not known what to say to that.
She had wrapped an extra loaf and given it to him without charging for it. Because some things did not have a price that made sense to put on them.
But bread sold to neighbors and the mercantile and the minister's household was one kind of accounting, and $55.12 due in 33 days was another kind entirely. One of those had been enough to keep her going, the other required a different solution. The Harlan Ranch letter was brief. A harvest season cook was needed beginning the 3rd week of September. Full board provided. The ranch would host its annual harvest feast in the 2nd week of October. 60 guests. Cattlemen's Association members. Neighboring ranchers. County figures of note. Base compensation $35. A $20 completion bonus upon satisfactory execution of the feast. She read the total twice. Then a 3rd time. She wrote back that same evening. 2 sentences. She accepted. She set the pen down and sat for a moment in the quiet of her kitchen. Her kitchen. In her house. On the 80 acres that had been hers and Walter's, and were still hers. Barely. For 33 more days, and she looked at the walls and the shelves, and her mother's cast iron hanging on its hook, and the rows of preserves in the cold cellar, and she let herself feel what she was going to do before she started doing it. Then she got up and made bread. Not because she needed to, because it was how she thought. Because the work of it, the measuring and the mixing and the long patient rhythm of hands in dough was the only thing that cleared her mind enough to see the road ahead without flinching. 1 loaf at a time. It was what she had told herself through the worst of the last 2 years and 4 months. 1 loaf at a time. The next thing, then the thing after that. And eventually you arrived somewhere. She packed the night before she left. Her knives wrapped in a cloth roll. Her mother's tin bread stamp a small disc Walter had carved himself 5 years ago. A raised C for Calloway so their bread at the market table could not be confused with anyone else's. She wrapped separately and placed in her apron pocket. She pressed it into the bottom of every loaf she made. She had been doing it so long it was no longer a habit. It was part of what making bread meant. She arrived at the Harlan Ranch on the 3rd Monday of September with her knives and her starter culture in a covered jar, and the full menu committed to memory from first course to last. She had not slept. She had spent the night before, at her kitchen table, going over quantities and timing and sourcing until the numbers sat clean, and still in her mind, until there was no room left in it for anything that was not the work. That was how Ruth Calloway handled fear. She turned it into a problem. And then she solved the problem. The Harlan Ranch kitchen was the finest she had ever worked in. She stood in the middle of it, and she breathed, and she let it settle over her. 2 iron stoves built solid and black along the south wall, a wide stone hearth with a bread oven set into the right side, deep and well-seasoned, a work table 12 feet long, scrubbed pale from years of use, worn smooth in the places where someone had stood for 1,000 hours doing what Ruth intended to stand for 6 weeks doing. A cold cellar below the floorboards reached by a hinged wooden door that smelled of clean earth and old brine when she lifted it. Hooks along the north wall hung with pots and pans of serious, well-kept quality bought for use, not decoration. Nothing on those hooks that hadn't earned its place. A window above the work table faced east, and Ruth would come to understand in the days that followed that it was the first window on the property to receive the morning light. It was a kitchen built by someone who had understood that feeding people was serious work. Standing alone in it for the first time, Ruth felt something loosen in her chest that had been pulled tight for a very long time. She felt like herself. She was still standing there when the far door opened. Dora Pratt was a woman who entered a room as though she had already measured it, and found it adequate. Medium height. Neatly featured. Hair dressed with considerably more care than the working hour of a ranch morning required. She had a smile she wore for entrances, polished. Particular, and took off again almost immediately once she reached where she was going. The way a person removes a coat when they've come indoors. She looked at Ruth with the cool, assessing expression of a woman who has already reached a conclusion and is only now gathering evidence to support it. "You're the cook, Ruth Calloway. I received Mr. Harlan's letter. My husband Cleet manages the ranch operations. I handle all domestic arrangements. Everything pertaining to food and household presentation falls under my authority." "Yes, ma'am." Dora stopped. She turned. "I prefer directness, Mrs. Calloway, because it prevents misunderstanding." "So do I. The Harvest Feast is the most significant event this ranch hosts. Among the guests this year are 4 members of the Cattlemen's Association Board, the county land agent, and the minister and his wife. What leaves this kitchen reflects on the Harlan name." She paused and let the pause do its work. "Not on you. On the family in the ranch." Another pause, shorter. "All food leaving this kitchen goes out under the ranch name. I manage all guest-facing presentation. I speak to the guests about the menu. I accept any compliments on behalf of the household." Her eyes moved briefly over Ruth in the way Ruth had spent most of her life learning to absorb without reacting to. "You cook. I serve. That is the arrangement." Ruth thought about the $55. She thought about November the 1st. James Harlan came through the kitchen door and closed it behind him. He stood just inside it for a moment. The way a man stands when he has come to say something and is making sure he has it right before he begins. His coat was off, his sleeves were rolled to the forearm, which was such an ordinary detail in the middle of everything that had just happened that it steadied Ruth slightly, the plain evidence of a man who had stopped thinking about appearances and was only thinking about the immediate truth in front of him. He crossed to the work table and stood on the far side of it, across from her. The same work table, the same positions, the same lamp, burning the same as it had burned every morning for 6 weeks at 5:45, when the rest of the world was still dark. "You're not all right," he said. "I'm fine." "You're not fine." He said it without any force, just correction. The same directness he brought to everything. "You stood in a hall full of 60 people and heard yourself described as plain and limited and a problem to be managed. And you came back in here and stood at your work table and you're telling me you're fine." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "What would you like me to say?" "I'd like you to say what's true." She looked at him across the work table in the lamplight. She thought about 6 weeks of getting up at 3:45 and working until the lamp needed trimming. She thought about 40 loaves with 40 stamps pressed into 40 bottom crusts that had been turned upside down and held up for a room full of people by a 4-year-old who had understood, without being told, that the mark on the bread was the mark of its maker,
and that the maker deserved to be known. She thought about 2 years and 4 months of managing. One loaf at a time. The next thing. And the thing after that. And getting through it. And getting through the next thing. And being adequate, and being capable. And being enough to hold the 80 acres, and pay the debt, and get to November still standing. She thought about a man sitting at the far end of her work table every morning for 6 weeks and asking about bread and meaning it. "I am not fine," she said. Her voice came out level. She was glad of that too. "I have spent this entire fall being the woman who is present enough to do the work and invisible enough not to be seen doing it. And I agreed to that because I needed the $55 and that was the arrangement. And I kept the arrangement. And then Dora Pratt stood up in that hall and made me into a footnote to my own work in front of 60 people. And called it honesty. And the room murmured along, and I had 40 loaves on those tables with my mark pressed into every one of them. And not one of those 60 people was supposed to look." She stopped. The kitchen was very quiet. Nobody murmured when it mattered. James said, "That's fine," she said. "I understand." Something in Dora's face settled, not softened, but confirmed. The precise expression of a woman whose expectation has been met. "Good," she turned toward the door. "Supply inventory is on the shelf by the cold cellar. I want to see your full menu plan by Thursday noon." She left without waiting for a reply. Ruth stood in the kitchen alone. She breathed out, slowly, through her nose. Then she tied her apron, pulled out her supply list, and got to work. The first days ran hard and long and almost entirely alone. She woke before 4 and worked until dark. And she did not stop between except to eat, standing at the work table. Because sitting down felt like losing pace, she could not afford to lose. She learned the kitchen's particular habits. The left stove ran hot in the 3rd hour of a long fire. The damper needed watching. The cold cellar's lowest shelf held its temperature better than the upper 2. The bread oven's iron door was heavy and closed with a thud that she could feel up her forearms when she pushed it. She tested her sourdough timing 3 mornings before she trusted the results in this particular oven at this particular altitude with this particular wood. Nobody came to the kitchen except to deliver supplies. Nobody spoke to her except to hand her an invoice. That was the arrangement. She had worked alone before. The work was enough. The work had always been enough. She did not need to be thanked. She had said that to herself 500 mornings running. She believed it. She discovered, with no preparation, that being told she was seen was not the same thing as being thanked, and that it reached somewhere the gratitude never had. "Thank you," she said quietly. She went back to the dough. Lily had not come back since the one morning, but Ruth heard her sometimes from the yard, singing something without words, the way small children sing when they are content, and not thinking about anything in particular. And the sound of it moved through the kitchen window and Ruth let it. She did not need to be thanked. She had her $55 within reach and her deed waiting and her 80 acres intact. That was the arrangement. And she had kept it. And in 4 more days it would be finished and she would go home. She told herself that every hour. She worked every hour. She did not look up from the work. She told herself that every morning while she waited for it to feel entirely true. It was a Tuesday evening of the first week, just past dusk, when the back door opened and a voice said, "Evening. You need anything from the supply shed before I close it up?" He was tall, the way men are tall who have been that height long enough to stop noticing it. Not reaching for any extra impression it might make. Work clothes carrying real dust from a real day. Nothing on him that was there for appearance. Dark hair with early silver coming in at the temples, the way it comes to a man who has been carrying something heavy for several consecutive years. He had a face that had moved some time ago past handsomeness into something steadier and more honest. The kind of face that had stopped working toward any particular impression and had arrived instead at just being what it was. He looked at her directly. Not in the cataloging way, not in the measuring way she had grown so accustomed to receiving, that she had nearly stopped registering it. Just a person looking at another person, square and without agenda. "I'm all right for tonight, thank you," Ruth said, "Mr. Harlan." He glanced around the kitchen with the eye of a man who knows every inch of a room without having to look for it. "James Harlan, I should have come by before now." "The stove on the left," she said. The third hour.
Runs hot. Damper wants watching.
He nodded once. You caught it.
First morning. He came to the kitchen the next morning at 5:45.
She heard the back door and turned expecting a ranch hand, but it was James Harlan, in his work clothes, had already on, moving toward the stove with the ease of a man doing something he had done every morning of his life. He lifted the coffee pot, poured himself a cup, and sat down at the far end of the work table. He wrapped both hands around the cup. Morning, he said.
Morning. She kept her hands in the dough. I hope I haven't commandeered your kitchen entirely. She went back to work. He looked at her again. The nod of a man who has been given accurate information and is noting it. Supply shed keys on the nail by the east door. Don't wait to be asked if you need something after dark. Thank you, Mr.
Harlan. Ruth said nothing for a moment, then, carefully, Nora does.
He looked at her.
She's been standing in the doorway for mornings now, Ruth said. Watch.
She won't come in. She will.
Ruth shaped the dough with both hands, pressing and turning. Curiosity always wins over caution. With children, it's only a matter of waiting.
He looked at her for a moment.
Something in his face had loosened the smallest fraction. Not much, just enough to see. You think so?
I know so. He left. Ruth looked at the closed door for a moment.
Then she went back to her bread. It's yours to run. I just take my coffee in here. He looked out the east window, where the sky was beginning to separate itself from the grass at the horizon. Quietest room in the house before the day starts. Had coffee here every morning since before my youngest was born.
I don't mind company.
He drank, she worked. Neither of them said anything. And the silence that sat between them was the comfortable kind, not the silence of two people avoiding each other, but the silence of two people who do not need noise to fill a room. He left, 20 minutes later. He put his cup on the shelf by the stove and said, "Much obliged," and walked out into the morning. He was back the next morning,
and the one after that.
By the end of the second week it had become a thing neither of them had named but both of them arrived at without question. 5:45. The coffee pot. The far end of the work table, Ruth's hands in whatever the morning required. Occasionally James asked a question, and his questions were never about the feast's social requirements or Dora's specifications or the guest list's expectations. They were about the work itself. Asked with the honest curiosity of a man who actually wanted to know the answer.
Why score the top before it bakes?
You can't stop the pressure inside from finding a way out. She dragged the lame across the surface of a proofed sourdough round. You can only tell it where to go. Otherwise it cracks where it chooses. And it doesn't always choose well. He considered that. My father used to say something similar about cattle moving through a narrow gate.
Most true things apply to more than one situation.
The edge of his mouth moved. Not a smile exactly. Something quieter than a smile, but more certain than one. The expression of a man who has heard something that fits a thing he already believed. My wife used to say, he said, turning his cup in a slow circle, that you could taste whether a person was paying attention when they made something. She said, a meal told you things about who made it, if you were listening, right?
Ruth kept her hands moving. She was right. Most people thought it sounded foolish.
Most people eat without paying much attention. She set the scored round aside and reached for the next. The taste is there. They're just not looking for it.
He was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the morning coming fully up over the east grass, gold and level. Clara got up at 5 to bake before the children woke. Said it was the only hour of the day that fully belonged to her. A pause. Not a heavy one, the kind a man makes when he is being careful with something that could break if held the wrong way. Thomas was 2 when she died. Lily was just past 1. She doesn't remember her at all. He finished his coffee. He put the cup on the shelf. The same shelf. The same practice placement. He put on his hat, which he had taken off at some point without Ruth noticing. He walked to the back door and paused there with his hand on the frame. Then she began to collect her things. She was at the back door, coat on, knife roll under her arm. When Amos came through from the hall, he looked at her. He looked at her coat and her things. And his face did what a face does when it has arrived too late to stop something and knows it. Ruth.
I'm done here. Amos. Her voice was level. The kitchen's clean. Everything for the second service is staged and labeled. They won't need me for the rest of the evening.
That's not. He stopped. He had the look of a man trying to find the right argument, and not finding it fast enough.
That's not what I came to say.
I know what you came to say. Then you know it isn't nothing. She looked at him. She had a great deal of respect for Amos Briggs, who had said true things to her plainly since the first week and asked nothing in return. She let that respect hold for a moment in the space between them.
It doesn't change anything, she said. I agreed to the arrangement. I cooked the feast. I have my compensation and I'm going home. She adjusted the knife roll under her arm. Thank you for everything you've told me this fall. I mean that.
He looked at her with 20 years of watching other people's lives behind his eyes. He stepped aside. The bread told you everything, he said quietly, if you were paying attention. He meant it for what she had said to him 6 weeks ago over a 5:45 cup of coffee. He meant it as an answer to that conversation, which had never fully ended, and as a statement about everything that had come after it. She understood exactly what he meant.
Yes, she said. It did. She liked this kitchen, he said. Not loudly. Not to the room. To the kitchen itself. Or to Ruth. Or to no one in particular. She could not have said. Clara spent more hours in it than anywhere else on the property. She would have had strong opinions about your sourdough.
Good ones or bad ones. Strong ones. He walked out. Ruth stood with her hands in the flour and looked at the closed door and told herself very clearly that the arrangement was the arrangement and the debt was the debt. And in 6 weeks she would go home to her 80 acres and her own kitchen and her own quiet, and she would not think about this kitchen, or this work table, or the particular sound a man's boots made going back out into the morning. She told herself all of that. Then the far door at the kitchen's end opened 3 inches and stopped. A face appeared in the gap. A girl of 9, dark-haired, serious-eyed, with the watchful, contained expression of a child who has learned to look before deciding anything and is in no hurry about the deciding. She looked at Ruth. She looked at the dough on the work table. She looked at Ruth's hands. Ruth did not move toward her. She did not perform the bright, encouraging smile that adults aimed at cautious children like something thrown across a distance. She said, "Good morning," in her ordinary voice, and went back to her work. The girl stood in the 3-inch gap of the doorway. She did not come in. She did not leave. She stood there and she watched Ruth's hands in the dough for a long time. And the kitchen was quiet. And the morning light came fully through the east window and lay gold on the work table. And neither of them said anything. When the girl finally pulled the door closed again, it was without a sound, careful as a held breath. Ruth looked at the door. On the other side of it, a child was deciding something. Ruth did not know yet what the decision would cost, or what it would start. She did not know about the question Nora Harlan would ask 11 days from now. Or the small tin stamp the girl would hold in her palm and look at for a long time. Or the particular way she would file what she learned into the serious interior of her memory. Carefully, like a key, she was not yet certain what it opened. Ruth only knew that the morning was hers and the bread was rising, and somewhere in the main house Dora Pratt was already planning tomorrow's instructions. She pressed both hands into the dough, 1 loaf at a time, she told herself. She did not know yet how much it was going to have to mean. Nora Harlan came through the kitchen door on the 11th morning, not the 3-inch gap, all the way through. Both feet. The door closing behind her with the quiet deliberateness that was already her signature way of moving through a space she was still deciding about. She stood just inside the threshold and looked at the work table and at Ruth's hands and at the row of shaped loaves waiting their second rise under damp cloths. "What are those for?" she asked. "Dinner rolls. They rise twice. First time I work the dough. Second time the dough works itself." Nora considered this. She moved 2 steps closer. "Why twice?" "The yeast needs time to do what it does. Rushing it gives you bread that's technically finished but doesn't taste like anything." Ruth didn't look up. Most things worth making need more time than seems reasonable. A pause. Another 2 steps. The girl was standing now at the corner of the work table.
close enough to see the cloths moving faintly with the swell of the dough underneath. Her eyes were her father's eyes, direct, unhurried, working toward a conclusion at their own pace. "May I watch?" "You may stand there as long as you like." She stood there. She came back the next morning before Ruth had begun shaping. She sat on the stool at the corner of the work table, the one Ruth had stopped using for hanging things on because she seemed to have understood without being told that it was the girl's stool now. And she watched in the attentive, non-intrusive way she had, which reminded Ruth less of a child watching an adult work and more of an apprentice watching a craftsman, noting everything, asking when she had a question and going quiet again as soon as it was answered, wasting no movement and no words. "What's that?" she asked on the third morning. Ruth had taken the tin stamp from her apron pocket and was pressing it into the bottom of the first finished loaf. A bread stamp. Ruth held it out. Nora took it with both hands and examined it with the full gravity she brought to every object she encountered. "What does the C mean?" "Calloway. My name. My husband made it." Ruth reached for the next loaf. "Before he died, we sold bread at the market in town. He cut the stamp so our loaves could be told from anyone else's, so people knew what they were buying." Nora turned it over in her palm. The raised letter, small and clean, pressed in a circle of border. "So people know it's yours. So people know it's ours." Ruth pressed the stamp into the second loaf and felt the satisfying give of the soft dough accepting the impression. His name and mine both start with the same letter. That was always a thing that pleased him. Nora was quiet for a moment, looking at the stamp with an expression Ruth could not entirely read. "You put it on everyone I make. I don't know how not to." The girl handed the stamp back with both hands, the careful way children return something they understand to be important. She asked no more questions about it that morning, but Ruth noticed the way Nora watched when she pressed the stamp into each subsequent loaf. Noting it, cataloging it in that serious interior of hers, filing it somewhere specific. Ruth told herself it was simply curiosity, the way a child stores information about the particular habits of a person they are learning to trust. She did not yet know it was also the shape of the truth preparing itself. Thomas Harlan did not come through the door the way his sister had. He arrived at the kitchen window. First, Ruth saw him, one afternoon, standing in the yard outside it, just at the edge of visibility, a small, 6-year-old boy, with a smear of grass stain on his knee and his hands shoved into his pockets, looking at nothing in particular near the kitchen's south wall. She had left the window open for the heat. The smell of the afternoon's baking was moving through it. She did not go to the window. She did not wave. She went on with her work. Ruth put a small roll on a plate and set it on the near end of the work table. So what was it? She set the note down on the table. She thought about how to say it. She thought about bread and what bread taught you about honesty. About the difference between something made in a hurry and something made with care. About how the intention went all the way through to what came out and could be tasted by anyone paying attention. "I'm not sure it's something you can find by looking," she said. "I think it might be something that has to be built. One morning at a time." She met his gaze. "If both people intend to build it." He came around the table. He stopped in front of her close, deliberate, with nothing on his face that was managing anything, and looked at her the way he had been looking at her since the third morning. Like she was worth looking at. Like nothing about looking at her required any adjustment or apology. "I intend to build it," he said. "I want you to know that. Not as a proposition. Not as an arrangement. Not as anything that has terms or conditions, or a side that owes something to a side that provides it." He held her gaze. "I want to get up every morning, and come into this kitchen, and ask you things you know, and listen to the answers, and watch your hands in the bread, and tell you true things, and hear true things back." He paused. "And I want to do it for the rest of my life, if you'll allow it." The kitchen was very quiet. "The children," Ruth said carefully. She did not say anything. She did not look at him directly. She went back to the stove. The farmhouse was cold in the way a house goes cold when nobody has been in it for 6 weeks. Not the abandonment cold of a place nobody loved, but the simple temperature of a room waiting patiently for its person to return. Ruth built the fire in the kitchen hearth before she did anything else, and sat in front of it for an hour without lighting the lamp, letting the cold work out of the walls and her bones in equal measure.
She did not think about the hall. She did not think about Lily on the chair with the upside-down loaf. She did not think about a man saying the bread told you everything if you were paying attention from the doorway of a kitchen she was not going to see again.
She sat with her fire, and she breathed, and she let the farm settle around her. The familiar sounds of it, the particular way the wind moved against this roof. The creak of the south wall in a north wind that she had been meaning to investigate for a year and a half, and had never gotten to. The smell of her own cold cellar coming up through the floorboards. Different from the Harlan Ranch's cold cellar, earthier, older, the smell of a place that had been hers for a long time.
She was home. She was grateful for it. She heard his feet on the kitchen floor. She heard him take the plate. She heard the small sound of a child eating. She kept her back to him. When she turned around 10 minutes later, the plate was on the table, and Thomas was gone. The roll was entirely eaten. That was how it went. For a week he ate standing at the near end of the work table without ever fully committing to being in the kitchen at all. And Ruth treated this with the same acceptance she brought to sourdough, not forcing it, not pulling at it, trusting the process to arrive at what it was going to arrive at in the time it actually needed. On the 8th evening he sat down.
He sat at the end of the work table and ate. And when he finished he did not immediately leave. He looked at his plate. He looked at the stove. He looked at Ruth's hands. "Nora says you make the bread with your hands. All the way in it," he said finally. He was at the door again the next evening. She put out the plate without being asked. He came in without being invited. Ate without being spoken to. Left the plate clean and empty. "That's right, our mama used to do that." He said it the way a 6-year-old boy says something he has been carrying carefully and is now attempting to set down in exactly the right place. Nora says she remembers. Ruth was very still for a moment. Then she said, evenly, "It's the best way to know if the dough is ready. The feel of it tells you things you can't see." He nodded, as though this were the explanation he had needed, and was now satisfied. He left a few minutes later. Ruth stood at the stove.
She did not need to be thanked. She had never needed to be thanked for the work itself. But some moments asked something different of her. Asked her to stand still inside them and let them be fully what they were, without moving away from them too quickly. This was one of those moments. A boy of 6 had carried his mother's memory into her kitchen like something in his hands and set it on the table. And it seemed to Ruth that the correct response was to receive it with the same care he had brought to the offering. She stood there. She went back to work. Lily Harlan came to the kitchen only once before the feast, and she came the way a 4-year-old comes to anything fully, without hedging, without the self-consciousness of the older children and without the small elaborate social preparations they had each made before entering Ruth's space. She simply opened the door and walked in and went directly to the work table and stood on her toes to see over its edge, both hands gripping the side. She was small even for 4. Dark curls her father clearly had no idea what to do with, pinned back by her sister with more determination than skill. She had Clara's eyes. Ruth knew that because Amos Briggs, the old supply driver, had told her so, in the way Amos said most things, which was once, directly, without embroidery. Lily looked at the bread cooling on the rack. She looked at Ruth. She looked at the kitchen around her, with the focused attention of a child encountering something familiar in a context she cannot quite place. "It smells like." She started, and then stopped and started again, organizing it. "It smells like how Mama's kitchen smelled." She said it without sentiment. The way 4-year-olds say true things. Because they have not yet learned to protect the people they are telling them to. Ruth did not answer for a moment. She could not have said why exactly. Except that the sentence needed a moment of space around it before anyone reached for what came next. "She baked bread too," Lily said. Still informational. Still simply reporting. She sounds like someone who knew what mattered. Lily regarded her for another moment. Then she took a step back from the work table, apparently satisfied, and walked back out of the kitchen with the same directness she had come in with. Ruth looked at the closed door. She pressed both hands flat on the work table and breathed. She did not need to be thanked. She had said that to herself more mornings than she could count.
She had always believed it to true. She was beginning to understand that believing something was true and having it cost nothing were not quite the same thing. He came to the kitchen on a Thursday afternoon in the third week to deliver the week's flour supply, which was his standing route, and he stayed to drink a cup of coffee, because he always did. And because he was a man of 62 who had worked the Harlan property for 20 years and had therefore earned the right to sit in whatever chair he chose, for however long it suited him.
It was Amos Briggs who told her about Clara.
He was compact and weathered, and said almost nothing. And what he said plainly, without preamble or softening, the way a man says things when he has long since decided that the truth delivered directly was kinder than the truth delivered with a lot of cushioning around it. He finished his coffee. He turned the cup in one slow circle.
He had his coffee this morning, he said.
Ruth was weighing flour. He has it every morning.
Ruth said nothing.
Before you came he had it alone. Amos set the cup down. Before you came he had it alone, and it took him about 5 minutes, and then he went out to the work and didn't come back inside until evening. Now he takes 20 minutes. He looked at the work table. Some mornings closer to 30.
Clara Harlan was a good woman,
Amos said. Steady, clear-eyed. She knew what the ranch was and she knew what James Harlan was, and she made a life that fit both of those things without asking either one to be different. He paused. She died of the fever in January 3 years ago. Lily was 13 months. He sat up 4 nights with her. Another pause. After, he ran the ranch the same as before. Did everything the same. Rose at the same hour, worked the same hours. Spoke when spoken to, answered every question put to him correctly. He looked at his empty cup. He just stopped tasting things.
Ruth had gone still, with her hands in the flour.
Nora told me last week, Amos said, not quite looking at her, that her papa cleaned his plate at supper. 3 nights running. He stood, picking up his hat from the table. First time she's been able to tell me that since before her mother died. He put the hat on. I thought you should know.
He left without waiting for any response. Ruth stood at the work table alone. She did not need to be thanked. She knew that. She had never cooked for gratitude. Had always held as a kind of faith the thing her grandmother had told her, that the intention behind the making was what fed people. Really not the flour and the water and the yeast, but the attention you brought to it. The fact of having thought about the person while your hands were in it. She had believed that for as long as she could remember. It did not require any witness or acknowledgement to be true.
She stood alone in the kitchen in the afternoon light and understood with the slow, certain weight of something that had already happened, and could not be unhappened, that she was no longer simply cooking to save her farm. She picked up her flour scoop. She went back to work. 1 loaf at a time. It did not stop the knowing. James asked her the next morning why bread smelled different when it was baking than when it was done. She told him about the fermentation and the Maillard reaction and the particular chemistry of heat acting on a properly developed dough. And he listened with both hands around his cup and his full attention on what she was saying. And when she finished, he said, Clara used to say the smell was the bread saying it was ready. She said if you had to cut into it to know, you haven't been paying attention.
She was right.
Ruth said she was right about most things she had an opinion on. He turned his cup. She had opinions on a great many things.
Were they welcome? He looked at her. The edge of his mouth moved.
Not always immediately, he said. Generally by the following morning. A pause. She had a way of being right in a manner that was difficult to argue with comfortably. She'd say a thing, and walk away, and leave it for you to find on your own. She thought the finding mattered.
It does.
Yes. He was quiet for a moment. It does. He looked at the east window where the light was coming fully up now over the grass. Nora has the same habit. Comes by it honestly. She's been showing me things about this kitchen. Ruth said. Where the good light falls in the afternoon. Which drawer sticks. The hook behind the cold cellar door where the extra oil lamp hangs. She kept her hands moving. She says her mother kept it there. James looked at her. She knows where everything in this kitchen belongs. Ruth said carefully. and I believe she has been waiting for someone to let her show them." He said nothing for a long moment. Then, "I should have thought of that."
"You've been managing a great deal."
"So have you," he said it simply, without making more of it than it was. A fact acknowledged. "On your own for 2 years.
"More than 2.
More than 2.
He held her gaze.
"I don't know how you do what you do the way you do it. Mrs. Calloway, I want you to know I see the work." Ruth was very still for a moment. He left at his usual time. The morning went on around her, and she worked inside it, and she told herself very clearly all the things she had been telling herself for 3 weeks. And they were all still true, and they were all becoming slightly less useful. It was 3 days later that she heard Dora Pratt's voice from the yard. Ruth was carrying a crate of winter squash from the supply shed to the cold cellar, moving in the back way through the side yard, when she heard 2 voices on the far side of the fence that divided the kitchen yard from the path to the bunkhouse. Dora and the wife of one of the cattle buyers coming through for the October inspection, a woman named Mrs. Aldrich, who had arrived the day before, and whose husband would be among the 60 Harvest Feast guests. She was not trying to hear, she simply stopped because she had to set down the crate to manage the cold cellar door. And by the time she had her hands free, the voices were already carrying. "The preparation has been considerable," Dora was saying, in the bright, carrying register she used for audiences. "I've been overseeing every aspect of the menu personally. It takes a certain kind of supervision to bring a feast of this scale together." "You must have extraordinary help," Mrs. Aldrich said. "A local woman. Capable enough. Within her limits. She understands my direction. Which is the main thing. Left to her own judgment entirely." A small pause. A sound that was not quite a laugh. "Well, one does what one can with what the county provides." Mrs. Aldrich made an agreeable murmuring sound. "The bread in particular has required considerable guidance from me." Dora continued, "I have strong views about bread." Ruth stood with the cellar door in one hand and the crate at her feet and said nothing. She let the words go past. She was good at this. She had been doing it since she was young enough to understand that a woman who reacted every time she was diminished would spend the better part of her energy reacting and have nothing left for anything else. She had learned the economy of it, how to let certain things pass through without taking hold. The way you let bad weather go past the window when you cannot go out and there is still work to be done inside. She came back up, closed the door, went back to the kitchen, and began the afternoon's work. She carried the squash into the cold cellar. She did not cry. She had not cried in 2 years and 4 months, and she was not going to begin over this. But that evening, when the kitchen was done and the ranch had gone quiet, and she was alone at the work table, with the lamp burning low, and her accounts for the week in front of her, she sat for a long time without touching the pen. 30 days had become 3 weeks. The $55 was half in reach. She had come here for the money, and the money was what mattered. And in 3 weeks she would have it, and she would go home. She would fix the south fence post and clean the cold cellar and put in the winter root order. And she would bake in her own kitchen and sell to her neighbors and answer to no one, and the arrangement would be over. She would not think about this kitchen. She would not think about 5:45 in the morning, or children coming to a doorway by degrees, or an old man saying he cleaned his plate 3 nights running. She would not think about any of it. She pulled the lamp closer. She opened her account book. She had been sitting there for a quarter hour, working through the numbers, when the kitchen door opened quietly and James Harlan stepped in. Not for coffee. Too late for coffee. He had his hat in his hand, and the look of a man who had decided something on the way across the yard and was now carrying out the decision before he could reconsider it. He stood just inside the door. "Cleet told me," he said, "what his wife said to Mrs. Aldrich this afternoon." Ruth set down her pen. "You don't need to. I'm not here to apologize on her behalf." His voice was quiet and level. "I'm here because I want you to know that I heard it, and I know what it was, and I know what it wasn't." He held her gaze steadily. "What comes out of this kitchen comes from you. Every person on this property knows it, and I will not have it said otherwise, not here." The lamp between them threw a long steady light across the work table. Ruth looked at him. "I appreciate that," she said carefully. "I do, but it's simpler not to." "It isn't simpler," Not sharp. Not raised. Just direct. It's easier in the short run and it costs you in every run after that. He turned his hat once in his hands. I've let things go unsaid on this property before. Mrs. Calloway. I've told myself it was because interfering made things worse, and I was wrong about that, and I know it. He looked at her directly. You deserve to know that I will not let it happen again. Ruth pressed her lips together. She had told herself so many mornings that she did not need this. The acknowledgement, the defense, the simple act of another person looking at what had been done and naming it plainly. She had told herself the work was its own sufficient thing, and required nothing from outside itself to be real. She had been telling herself that for 2 years and 4 months, and most of the mornings before that too. She understood, sitting in the lamplight with 33 days' worth of careful management beginning to give way in her chest like the first crack in a winter-frozen river, that she had been telling the truth and missing something in it at the same time. The work was its own sufficient thing, that was true, it did not require witness to be real, but being seen by someone worth being seen by was not the same thing as requiring it. And not needing a thing and not wanting it were, she was discovering, not the same sentence at all. Thank you, she said, her voice came out steady. She was glad of that. Ruth sat at her work table for a long time after the kitchen door closed. The lamp burned. The account book was open in front of her. The numbers in it were almost good enough. 23 days left. 3 more weeks in this kitchen, this work table, this east-facing window, this particular silence at 5:45 in the morning before the day began. He nodded once. He put his hat on. He walked back out into the dark. She did not need to be thanked. She was realizing, to get through the next 3 weeks without losing the careful management that had gotten her this far. And she was no longer as certain as she had been that she was going to be able to do that. The bread tomorrow would take 4 hours at minimum. She had a new sourdough culture to feed. A stock to put up. 2 test batches of the honey wheat to get through before she was satisfied with the timing in this oven at this season. 1 loaf at a time. She told herself. She picked up her pen. Outside, somewhere in the main house. Dora Pratt was planning tomorrow's arrangements, and James Harlan had gone back to whatever end of the property a man goes to when he has said a true thing out loud and is now alone with the fact of having said it. And Ruth Calloway sat in the warmest room in the house and added her numbers, and told herself what she had been telling herself for 2 years and 4 months, and understood with quiet, complete certainty that she was in a great deal of trouble that had very little to do with the debt and everything to do with the man who had just walked back out into the dark. She did not look up from the numbers. She kept going. The last week before the feast ran the way the last week before any large and important thing runs faster than the weeks before it. And with less margin for anything to go wrong. And with a quality of compressed attention that left no room in Ruth's mind for anything except the work. That was a mercy. She was up at 3:45 every morning. She worked until the kitchen went dark, and she could not see clearly enough to trust her own hands. And then she lit the lamp and worked until the lamp needed trimming. And then she trimmed it, and worked until the ache in her back had moved past pain into the numb, reliable territory beyond it where the body simply continues because it has been told to. She made stock. She put up the last of the preserved fruit she needed for the dessert course. She tested the braided celebration loaves twice before she was satisfied that the oven's particular temperament in the first cold week of October had been accounted for. She planned the order of the feast's 8 bread varieties by baking time and cooling time and optimal serving temperature, and committed the entire sequence to memory so that on the day itself, she would not need to stop and calculate anything that could be done in advance. She built the feast from the ground up, the way you build anything that has to hold under its own weight and not fail in front of people. James came at 5:45. Always. Even in that last week, when every hour she had was accounted for, he came through the back door and lifted the coffee pot and sat at the far end of the work table and asked his questions about the work, and she answered them. And the kitchen was warm against the early October cold outside, and neither of them said anything about the things they were not saying. Nora came every morning and sat on her stool and watched. She had begun, in that last week, to do small tasks without being asked, carrying cooled loaves to the shelf in the correct order, refilling the flour bin before Ruth could ask for it, keeping the small children out of the kitchen when Ruth needed the space entirely to herself, which Nora seemed to understand by some form of perception that did not require explanation. Thomas lingered at the kitchen door each evening and ate his supper roll, and left his plate clean. The morning of the feast arrived, gray and still, with a flat October sky that sat low over the Dakota grass and held the cold in close to the ground. Ruth had not slept. She had been in the kitchen since 3, moving through the final preparations with the kind of stillness that comes when a person has pushed past exhaustion far enough to arrive at something past it. A clear, quiet, mechanical state where the hands do what needs doing and the mind tracks the sequence, and there is no room inside either of them for anything that is not the immediate task. By 9 o'clock the cold cellar held 14 pies in careful rows, wrapped and waiting. The stocks were made and reduced, and made again, because the first batch of the gravy base had not been right, and she did not put things on a table that were not right. The smoked shoulder from the night before had been resting since dawn, filling the kitchen with the kind of smell that arrived in a room and changed the character of it entirely. The bread was last, as it always was. Because bread was her and bread needed to be present, not merely prepared. She began the first batch at 9:30. By 11 she was into the third. By 1 in the afternoon, all 8 varieties were out, cooling on the racks and the work table and the shelf along the south wall. 40 loaves, honey wheat and sourdough, and dark rye, and soft dinner rolls, and the braided celebration loaves with their gloss tops, and the 2 specialty rounds she had been planning since the second week of September. She stood at the work table and looked at them. She picked up the tin stamp from her apron pocket and she went along the row, lifting each loaf in turn, pressing the stamp into the bottom crust, setting it back, one at a time, 40 times. The small raised seat pressed clean into each one. She did not know why she always needed to do this last, after everything else was done. She had asked herself that question many times over the years, and never arrived at a satisfying answer. It was not about ownership. It was not about proof. It was something older than either of those things. The same impulse that had made her grandmother wrap her sourdough starter in a damp cloth and carry it across the Missouri in 1847, not because she needed to establish that it was hers, but because you kept the thing alive, and you carried it with you, and you put your mark on what came from it, so the care inside it could be traced back to its source. It was something she did not have a precise word for, and had long since stopped trying to find one. She set the stamp back in her apron pocket. She looked at the 40 loaves on the work table and the racks and the shelf. She looked at the kitchen, the hearth, the stoves, the cold cellar door, the east window where the afternoon light was coming in level and gold over everything she had built in 6 weeks, the warmest room in the house. She had heard that phrase every morning since the first week, and she understood now that it had not started as description. It was what the room had always been, before she came, because of who had worked in it before her. And it had stayed true because of what had happened in it in the last 6 weeks. And it would go on being true after she was gone, because some rooms take on the character of the work done inside them and hold it, the way good cast iron holds seasoning. She was going to miss it. She had known she was going to miss it for at least a week and had been declining to examine that fact directly. She examined it now, briefly, in the flat October light. And then she put it away and went to check the cold cellar. She knew it the way she knew a finished loaf, not by looking at it, not by any external measure, but by feel, by the particular weight of it in her hands, by the certainty, quiet and complete, that the thing had been made right all the way through. It had. Amos and 2 of the ranch hands moved the food from kitchen to table in the steady relay that Ruth had organized, to the minute. She stayed in the kitchen and managed the timing, and the temperature of the serving dishes, and the order of the courses, and she did not go through the door, into the barn hall because that was the arrangement, and she had agreed to the arrangement, and she kept agreements she made. Dora was everywhere in the hall. Ruth could hear her through the wall, the bright, carrying voice, the particular way she moved through a room of guests, making her presence felt without appearing to press. She heard the sounds of the feast, building chairs, conversation, the particular layered warmth of 60 people who had been fed well and knew it. Feedback came back through Amos.
and the hands in fragments. The Cattlemen's Association chairman had put his fork down after the first bread course and asked who had made it. Amos had heard Dora answer without pausing. The ranch kitchen, she had said, a Harlan household recipe. Everything made under my direction, and had come back through to the kitchen with his face carrying the expression of a man who has heard something incorrect said in public and is weighing the cost of correcting it.
Ruth had looked at him and shaken her head. Once, he had pressed his lips together and gone back out.
The second course moved out. The third. Ruth tracked the timing with the part of her mind that did such things automatically now. Built from 6 weeks of running this kitchen, and she kept her hands moving, and she did not let herself think about the words she was hearing through the wall.
The Harlan name, my direction, my recipes.
She kept going. The shoulder came out last. Carved and arranged. And after it the pie course. And after that Ruth stood alone in the kitchen for the first time in 14 hours and untied her apron and sat down on the stool at the corner of the work table, Nora's stool, and closed her eyes for just a moment, because the room had gone slightly soft at the edges in the way rooms go when a body has been pushed past what it reasonably ought to sustain.
She was almost at peace. And then through the wall, clear and carrying,
Dora Pratt's voice rose into the particular register of a woman about to make a toast. The silence in the barn hall told her when it was coming. The way a certain quality of stillness tells you something is about to begin. 60 people settling into attention. The particular quiet of a room waiting to be addressed. Ruth opened it.
She read the number.
She read it again. She set it on the table very carefully. The way you set something down when you want to make sure it stays where it is. He asked for you by name. Amos said, told 2 of the association board members about the bread before he even left the property, told them your name, not the ranch's name, not the Harlan household, yours. He picked up the cup she had poured for him without being asked. Said it was the finest bread he'd eaten in 30 years and that whoever made it ought to have their name in front of people.
Ruth looked at the paper on the table.
She thought about the Cattlemen's Association winter dinner in January. 60 tables. Her name on the program. The reputation that travels ahead of you into every room before you walk in. She thought about 1 dinner, and then 2, and then a name that meant something. In this county and the ones adjacent. Built on work done with attention and intention. And the honest knowledge her grandmother had carried across the Missouri in 1847, and never stopped passing forward. I want to take a moment, Dora said, to speak to the extraordinary meal you've all enjoyed this afternoon.
Ruth did not move.
Many of you have asked about the food. I want to be honest with you. Because honesty is a thing I value above almost everything else. The word honest moved through the wall and landed in the kitchen with a weight Dora had not intended. We do employ a local woman to assist in the kitchen, a widow from outside of town, hardworking in the simple way, dependable enough within her limitations. A light, social pause, but what you've eaten today was not simply the product of her efforts. Every dish was planned under my direct supervision. Every standard, every decision about the menu, the presentation, that guidance came from me. Another pause, timed the way a person times a pause when they have rehearsed the speech. She executed, I directed. Without that direction, I'm afraid the result would have been considerably more rustic.
A sound moved through the hall.
Not quite laughter. The comfortable murmur of a room receiving something it expects. I say this not to diminish her. Dora's voice was warming to the room, reaching for it. I say it in the interest of transparency. When you take on that sort of help, plain, local, a woman whose world does not extend much past her kitchen and her difficulties, you learn to manage expectations. It is simply the nature of the situation. A practiced pause. She does her best. One cannot ask more than that.
The murmur again.
Warmer this time. Ruth sat on the stool. She had been sitting very still since the first sentence, and she went on sitting still now. Both hands in her lap, and she let it come in, and she let it pass through.
Every loaf on every table. 40 loaves.
6 weeks of 4 in the morning and cold fingers, and the second rise and the third batch and the test batches, and the grandmother starter she had been tending for the whole of her adult life, and the mother's knowledge, and the work done with intention. Done with attention. Done while thinking about the 60 people who would eat it and wanting it to be good for them. Genuinely good. Not merely adequate.
She did not need to be thanked. She stood up from the stool. She did not cry. She had not cried in 2 years and 4 months, and she was not going to begin in a ranch kitchen with 60 people on the other side of the wall.
She took off her apron, she folded it and laid it on the work table. She went to the shelf where she had put her knife roll that morning. She picked it up. She looked at the kitchen. The stoves. The hearth. The east window. The work table worn pale from 1,000 hours of work. That had all been worth doing, and she let herself see it one time, clearly, for what it was and had been. The cold hit her like something real after the heat of the kitchen, sharp and clean and level, the particular cold of a Dakota Territory October afternoon that did not pretend to be anything except what it was. She went down the back steps and across the kitchen yard, and she did not look back at the barn hall, and she did not allow herself to look toward the east window where the late afternoon light was still doing what it did every day, regardless of who was watching it. She was at the gate to the property road when she heard, from the barn hall behind her, a sound that stopped her feet. Not Dora's voice. Not the murmur of the crowd.
A child's voice, small and clear and carrying the absolute authority that belongs to a 4-year-old who has decided to say a thing and sees no reason not to say it fully.
Ruth stood at the gate.
She should keep walking. She knew that. Every reasonable part of her knew exactly what the correct thing was, and it was to put one foot in front of the other, and let the sound of the property go behind her, and start the walk home while the light held.
She stood at the gate and she listened. She could not hear the words from the gate. She could only hear the shape of the voice. Small, direct, without any understanding that it was interrupting anything. The voice of a child who had something to say and was saying it.
Then a second voice. Older. Nora.
The murmur of the hall had stopped. She had noticed that, the moment Lily's voice began, the particular silence of a room of 60 people who have been surprised into stillness. The sound had not built toward silence. It had gone there instantly, in the space between one moment and the next, as those 60 people had all remembered how to be quiet at exactly the same time.
Ruth's hand was on the gatepost. She heard Dora's voice rise sharp,
managing, attempting, the tone of an adult dismissing a child's innocent confusion.
She heard Nora again. Steady. Clear.
Then a silence that lasted long enough to be its own kind of statement. Then a man's voice she did not immediately recognize. Low and deliberate. Not James, someone speaking with the careful weight of a person choosing to say a difficult thing in a public place, having decided that not saying it was no longer bearable.
Ruth turned around.
She was back through the kitchen yard and up the back steps before she had made a conscious decision about it, driven by something below reasoning that knew what was happening on the other side of that wall and knew she needed to be present for it the way you need to be present for anything that has your name in it. She came through the kitchen without stopping, and pushed through the door into the corridor, and then through the corridor door into the barn hall.
60 people. Every face turned in the same direction.
Lily Harlan was standing on her chair at the family's table near the front of the hall. She was holding a loaf of bread in both arms. One of the honey wheat rounds from the near basket, the way a small child holds something they have been told is important to carry carefully. She had it turned upside down.
She was holding up the bottom crust. The raised C, pressed clean into the pale surface, was visible from the back of the room.
That's Ruth's letter, Lily said into the absolute silence of 60 people holding completely still. She puts it on everything she makes. Papa, she turned the loaf slightly toward her father, who was standing at the far edge of the room, with his hands very still at his sides. Ruth puts her letter on everything. I saw her.
Nobody moved.
Nora was on her feet beside her sister. Her hands were at her sides, and her face was composed the way her face was always composed. The particular steadiness of a 9-year-old who has made a decision and is carrying it without flinching. Every loaf, she said, not loudly, not performing, stating a fact to a room that needed the fact stated. I watched her. Every morning she stamps every loaf before it goes into the oven. Every loaf on this table has her mark on it. Dora Pratt's voice came in fast and bright. Children notice all kinds of bests. Mrs. Pratt. The voice came from the end of the nearest table. The Cattlemen's Association chairman, a broad man with a gray beard who had driven 2 counties for this dinner, set down his napkin and looked at Dora Pratt with an expression that did not leave any comfortable space between them. I'd like to hear what the children are saying."
The room went very still again. It was Cleet Pratt who stood up. Ruth had not noticed him until he moved. He had been sitting at the far side of the hall. Not at the family table. At the far end of a bench near the wall. And he stood up slowly, the way a man stands up when he has been sitting with something too heavy for too long and has finally decided to put it down regardless of the cost of setting it down in public. He was a quiet man. Ruth had understood that about him from the first week. He managed the ranch operations with a competence that had nothing theatrical about it. A man of practical silences and direct decisions who had the misfortune of being married to someone for whom public performance was a primary need and a primary weapon. She had watched him over 6 weeks receive information about the ranch kitchen through Dora's version of it and say nothing. And she had understood that his saying nothing was not agreement and was not approval and was not, at its core, comfort. It was the silence of a man sitting in the debt of a decision he had already made and couldn't unmake. He stood up. He looked at Dora once. Not long. The look of a man who has reached the end of something. Then he looked at the room. "My wife didn't make this food," he said. His voice was level. It carried without effort. "She's never made bread like what's on this table in her life. Mrs. Calloway made every dish on these tables." He paused, not for effect, because he was being careful with the truth. And being careful with it took a moment. "I watched her do it, 6 weeks, beginning at 4 in the morning, alone in that kitchen. Every recipe is hers. Every method is hers. Everything you've eaten tonight came from her." He looked at the table in front of him rather than at anyone in particular. That ought to be said plainly in front of the people who ate it. He sat back down. The silence that followed was a different kind from the silences before it. Not the silence of shock. The silence of a room of 60 people absorbing something that had just rearranged the shape of the last 2 hours in their memory. Ruth stood in the doorway between the corridor and the hall. She had not moved since she came through. She was not certain her legs would carry her anywhere more purposefully than standing. Lily was still on her chair holding the upside-down loaf. She had been watching her father since Cleet stood down. With the focused patience of a child waiting for the adult world to catch up to what she had already understood. Now she looked across the room and found Ruth in the doorway. "Ruth," she said, the same way she said everything directly, without preamble. As though the world were a simple enough place that you could just say the true thing and it would land where it needed to land. "I showed them your letter." Ruth looked at the small girl on the chair with the loaf in her arms, and the seed pressed into the crust, and the absolute composure of someone who has done exactly what she set out to do, and sees no reason to be surprised that it worked. "I see that," Ruth said. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect it to. "Because it's yours." Lily set the loaf down on the table. Carefully, the way she had been carrying it. Something that needed to be handled right. "Everything you make has your letter on it. So people know. So people know it's ours." Ruth pressed her lips together. The room was beginning to move again. The slow return of 60 people to conversation and reaction, and the business of responding to what they had just witnessed. The cattleman's chairman was speaking to the man beside him. Several of the neighboring ranchers were looking at the bread baskets on their tables with a new species of attention. 2 of the women near the center were talking in low voices that had the particular quality of voices recalibrating. Dora Pratt was standing at the front of the hall beside the empty space where her toast had been. And what was in her face was something Ruth had not seen there before, not anger. Or not only anger. Something that was working against itself, several things at once competing for the surface. She looked at her husband, she looked at the room. She looked at Ruth in the doorway. What passed between them was not warmth. Ruth had not expected warmth. What it was, stripped of everything else, was something closer to recognition. The reluctant acknowledgement of a woman who has been doing a thing and knows now that it has been seen for what it was. Not just by a room full of witnesses, but by herself. In the moment of the room seeing it. It was not nothing. It was not enough. But it was not nothing. Then, James Harlan was at her shoulder. She had not heard him cross the room. He had come from wherever he had been standing, and he was there now, close behind her in the doorway.
And she could hear in his breathing the particular quality of a man who has been holding a great deal of something very still and is not doing that anymore. "Come back to the kitchen," he said. Quietly, not a request exactly, not an instruction. Something between them, the voice of a man saying, "Come somewhere real with me."
Ruth turned. She looked at him. His face had nothing managed about it. Nothing in it that was working toward a particular outcome or running the calculation of how this appeared. It was just his face, with everything that had been in it for 6 weeks and nothing on top of it anymore. "The kitchen is not where I need to be right now," she said. "I was leaving." "I know." He held her gaze. "I know you were. Come back anyway." She looked at him for a long moment. Behind her in the hall, the room was reassembling itself. Conversations resuming, the particular sound of 60 people who have witnessed something honest and are now deciding what to do with it. Somewhere in that sound, Lily Harlan was climbing down from her chair with the careful negotiation of a child descending from a height, and Nora was steadying her without being asked. And Cleet Pratt was sitting very still at the end of his bench looking at his hands. Ruth looked at James Harlan. She looked at the kitchen door. "5 minutes," she said. His mouth moved. Not a smile. Something that would be a smile, in a moment. When there was room for it. He stepped back from the doorway to let her through. Ruth walked back into the kitchen, her kitchen, for 4 more minutes. For whatever these last minutes were, and she stood at the work table, and she waited. And the warmest room in the house held around her in the October dark. And through the wall she could hear the hall behind her, still finding its way back to itself. She pressed one hand flat on the work table. She waited. Ruth looked at him. "When Lily stood up," he said. "When Nora said what she said. When Cleet." He stopped. He ran one hand over the back of his neck. Nobody in that room had a comfortable expression on their face after Cleet sat back down. "I want you to know what that room looked like." It looked like 60 people who had just been told something they already half knew and were ashamed they had needed a 4-year-old to say it plainly. Ruth's hands were flat on the work table. She did not speak. "What my daughter did in that hall," James said carefully, "she did because you showed her what the stamp meant, and why you used it, and she filed it away in that particular way she has. She did it because in 11 days she had already understood that the bread came from you, and the mark on it came from you, and the work behind it came from you, and that those things mattered enough to be true in public, not just in here." He held her gaze. "She is 9 years old, and she had better judgment tonight than every adult in that room, including me." Ruth looked at him. "You knew," she said. "You knew for 6 weeks what the arrangement was, and what Dora was doing with it." "Yes, you said something to her once. In the yard. I heard from Amos, once." His voice was even. "I should have said it more than once. I should have said it where it counted. In front of people. In a way that cost something. I said it in the yard because it was easier than the alternative, and I told myself I was respecting your independence. And the truth is, I was doing what I have done before on this property, which is letting hard things sit because addressing them directly meant admitting what I already knew about the shape of the situation." He looked at his hands on the far edge of the work table. "I already knew what this arrangement was. I knew it before you arrived. I let it continue because I didn't want to, because I thought." He stopped. "What did you think?" He looked up. The lamp between them threw his face into a plain, steady light that left nothing to manage and nothing to hide. "I thought I should not act on what I was feeling because I had no right to feel it while you were employed in my kitchen and I was responsible for the conditions you were working in. I thought the decent thing was to stay on my side of the table and keep my coffee and my questions and let 6 weeks run out and let you leave with your $55 and not complicate it." The kitchen held the silence the way the kitchen had always held silences, fully, without rushing them toward anything. "That was not an entirely wrong instinct," Ruth said carefully. "No." He acknowledged it. "But I took decency and I used it as an excuse to do nothing. And doing nothing is what allowed you to stand in that hall tonight." He held her gaze. "I am not asking you to forgive that tonight. I am only asking you to hear that I know it." Ruth looked at him for a long moment. She had been telling herself that for 6 weeks, and it had been true, and it had also not been enough to stop any of it. "I'm not easy," she said. The words came out before she had decided to say them, but they were true and so she let them stand. "I want to say that plainly because I think it matters.
I am particular about my work and I have strong opinions about most things, and I do not manage well when people speak to me as though I am furniture. She kept her eyes on his. I have been alone for more than 2 years, and I have become accustomed to my own counsel, and I do not expect that to change easily.
I know that,
James said.
I am also.
She stopped. She started again. I am not a woman people choose. Mr. Harlan. The words cost something, and she said them anyway, because the cost of not saying them was higher. I have spent the better part of my life being the woman who feeds people and is thanked by no one and reminded by various means that I should be grateful for whatever small portion is left after everyone else has helped themselves. Her voice was steady. She held to that. I do not know how to trust the contrary without more evidence than a morning at a work table.
He came around the table. He moved deliberately, without urgency, with the careful attention of a man who has understood that the distance he is crossing is not only physical.
He stopped at her end of the table, close enough that she did not need to raise her voice, close enough that she could see clearly every part of his face that was not managing anything.
I am not asking you to trust it tonight.
He said, tonight is tonight, and I have no business asking for anything tonight, except to say what is true, and leave you to do what you need to do with it. He held her gaze. What is true is this: I have sat at the end of this table for 6 weeks and asked you about bread, because I meant the questions. And listened to the answers, because I meant the listening, and come back the next morning, because this was the only hour of the day that felt entirely real. A pause. And I know the difference, Mrs. Calloway, between a habit and a need. The coffee is a habit, this is not.
The lamp between them burned very still. She had come to the Harlan Ranch with her knives and her starter culture and her $55 problem, and she had kept her head down and done the work and told herself every morning that the work was sufficient and required nothing from outside itself, and that the arrangement was the arrangement, and the distance between her world and his was the kind of distance feelings could not cross, regardless of how naturally a man asked about bread and meant it.
Ruth looked at James Harlan and understood with the full clear weight of something that had been true for a long time and was only now allowed to stand in the light. That she had been wrong about the distance. That the distance had been closing since the second morning. And she had measured it every day and told herself it was still unsurvivable, and she had been wrong about that too. I need to go home, she said.
I know.
I need to go home and pay my debt, and fix my fence post, and sleep in my own bed, and be alone with my own kitchen for a while.
Yes,
he said it without any attempt to negotiate it. You do.
She looked at him for one more moment.
The bread stamp, she said quietly. Lily. Something in his face shifted, moved, settled into something that was going to be a smile, in a moment when the rest of the situation allowed room for it. She was very determined, he said. She had it worked out entirely on her own. Nora told me she had been thinking about it since the morning you explained it to her. Ruth pressed her lips together hard. She was not going to cry. She had not cried in 2 years and 4 months, and she was not going to begin in a ranch kitchen over a 4-year-old who had held up a loaf of bread and said that's Ruth's letter as though it were the simplest and most obvious fact in the world.
She was not going to cry.
The dinner service tomorrow, she said, her voice coming out with only the smallest fracture in it. The cold cellar has everything labeled and staged. I'll make sure it's managed. The sourdough starter on the 3rd shelf needs to be fed by 8 in the morning, or you'll lose the culture. I'll see to it.
She picked up her knife roll from the work table.
She picked up her coat. She looked at the kitchen one last time, the stoves, the hearth, the east window, the work table worn pale in the center where 1,000 hours of good work had been done and would go on being done by whoever came after.
The warmest room in the house, she said. She was not speaking to him exactly. She was speaking it to the room, or to herself. The way you say a thing out loud once before you stop being able to.
She walked out into the October dark. She was home by nightfall. She went to bed and she slept for 10 hours without moving. And she woke up on a Tuesday morning in mid-October, with the pale early light in her east window, and her own kitchen waiting, and $55 wrapped in a cloth in her coat pocket.
She paid the debt,
That Wednesday, she stood at the land office counter and counted out the bills, and watched the clerk record the final payment in the ledger. And she held the deed afterward for a moment in both hands, the paper plain and official and real, before she folded it and put it away. She walked home. She fixed the south fence post that same afternoon. She cleaned out the cold cellar and relaid the shelves and started a new batch of sourdough with the starter she had been carrying for the whole of her adult life. The one that went back to her grandmother's kitchen in Nebraska, and before that, presumably, to whatever kitchen that grandmother had learned in, and before that to a woman she would never know who had understood that the important things needed to be kept alive and carried with you through whatever you had to cross.
She baked bread on Thursday.
She stood in her own kitchen, in her own house, on her own 80 acres, and she baked bread and it smelled the way it always smelled, and her hands knew what to do without being told, and the morning was hers entirely, and she told herself this was what she had been working toward, and she believed it. And she also stood at the east window at 5:45 with her coffee, and looked at the grass and the gray sky, and the long open distance, and felt the silence of the kitchen in a way she had not felt it before.
She did not need to be thanked.
She was discovering, to decide what she actually wanted.
What she wanted her 80 acres. She had them. She wanted her kitchen. She had it. She wanted her work to be her own, and her name on what she made. And the knowledge that the intention she put into the making went all the way through to what came out. She had all of that, had always had it, and a room full of 60 people now knew it, and so did the Holt County Land Record, and so did her own ledger.
She wanted Nora's stool at the corner of her work table, and a small boy eating his supper roll, without being asked, and the 4-year-old who said things plainly because she hadn't yet learned that the world asked you to hedge.
She wanted 5:45 in the morning,
and questions about bread asked by a person who meant them. She set down her coffee. She went back to work. It was Amos who came first. He arrived on a Thursday 2 weeks after the feast, driving the supply wagon with no supplies in it and a folded piece of paper in his coat pocket that he set on her kitchen table before he even sat down. "The chairman of the Cattlemen's Association," he said, "wants to know if you'll cook the regional winter dinner in January. 60 tables, Laramie." He nodded at the paper, his offers in there. She thought about her 80 acres and her kitchen, and her deed. She thought about what else she wanted.
She picked up a pen. She wrote 2 letters.
The first to the Cattlemen's Association chairman in Laramie, accepting the January dinner, naming her terms, signing it, Ruth E. Calloway. The second she stared at for a long time before she wrote it. When she finally did, it was short. "I believe there is a sourdough culture on the 3rd shelf of your cold cellar that needs attention. I will come by Thursday morning at 5:45, if that is agreeable. R. Calloway." She sealed both letters. She sent them the next morning. Thursday came the way October Thursdays come in Dakota Territory, clean and cold and honest, with a sky the color of good iron, and a wind that meant what it said. She arrived at the Harlan Ranch back door at 5:45 exactly. Because that was the hour her feet knew the kitchen opened, the door was unlocked, she let herself in. The kitchen was exactly as she had left it. The stoves. The hearth. The east window catching the first pale edge of morning over the grass. The work table. Long and pale and worn smooth in the places where she had stood for 1,000 hours. The coffee pot was on the stove, warm. Beside it on the work table, a cup turned right side up, waiting.
And next to the cup, a folded piece of paper.
She crossed to the table. She picked up the paper and unfolded it. The handwriting was blunt and direct, the same as its owner.
"I looked for what you left. Could not find it. Perhaps you can tell me what it was. J. H." Ruth stood in the kitchen holding the note.
She was still holding it when the back door opened and James Harlan came in with his hat in his hand, and dust already on his boots from whatever he had been doing in the hour before this. His face carrying the look of a man who had prepared something to say and had just decided that the preparation was less honest than arriving empty-handed.
He stopped.
"Morning," he said. "Morning," she said.
They looked at each other across the work table. The same work table. The same kitchen. The same morning light beginning its work on the east window,
and outside it the same grass running flat and gold and enormous to the horizon. 45 mornings they had stood in this room together, and this one was the same and entirely different. Because there was nothing between them now except the distance across the table, and even that was not the kind of distance it had been.
I went through the whole kitchen, he said. He looked at the note still in her hand. Every shelf. Couldn't find anything.
I know, she said. Nora asked me last week when you were coming back. James said. She asked me once, directly, and then she went back to whatever she was doing and did not ask again because she was waiting to see what I was going to do about it, which is exactly how her mother would have handled the same situation. The edge of his mouth moved toward what it had been moving toward for 6 weeks. Thomas asked Amos. Lily has been carrying your bread stamp around in her pocket for 2 weeks. I have no idea how she got hold of it.
Ruth's hand went to her apron pocket. Empty. She looked at him.
She found it on the kitchen shelf the morning after the feast, he said. I've tried twice to get it back. She tells me she's keeping it safe until you come back for it. He paused. She said, and I'm quoting exactly, that you can't make the right bread without it. Ruth pressed her lips together with the fullness of a person holding several different things at once, none of which were small.
She's not wrong,
Ruth said finally.
She rarely is.
He looked at her steadily. Come home, Ruth.
She looked at him.
I'll need to bring my starter culture, she said.
Of course.
And my mother's cast iron. I wouldn't expect otherwise. And my kitchen at the farm stays in the family deed. I'm not surrendering the 80 acres.
It's yours,
he said simply. It stays yours. She thought about 2 years and 4 months of one loaf at a time. She thought about her grandmother crossing the Missouri with the starter wrapped in a damp cloth and the absolute conviction that feeding people with intention was the most honest labor a person could do. She thought about her 80 acres and her deed and her kitchen and the south fence post she had finally fixed. She thought about the things she wanted, which she had given herself permission to look at plainly, and which she had been looking at plainly for 2 weeks. And she knew what they were. She looked at him for one more moment, in the 5:45 light, with the east window doing what it did every morning, and the coffee pot warm on the stove and the cup on the table waiting where it had always waited. Yes, she said.
He asked her properly 3 weeks later.
Not in the kitchen. On the porch of the Callaway farm at the end of an evening where he had come to help rebuild the stone foundation on the south side of the house and had stayed for supper and then stayed considerably longer than supper, the way a person stays when leaving does not make any particular sense anymore. He asked her plainly and without ceremony, because he was a plain man and she would not have trusted it any other way. She said yes, the same way. Plainly. Looking at him directly, with the Dakota sky going enormous and cold and full of stars above the grass.
They were married on a Saturday morning in November, not at the Harlan Ranch, at the Callaway farm, in the yard, on ground that was hers and would remain hers, with the deed in the house and the south fence post holding and the cold cellar full and the sourdough starter on the kitchen shelf, alive and tended, as it had always been. Amos drove out from the ranch and sat in the front row of the neighbors' chairs, with his hat in his lap and the expression of a man who has been watching other people's lives long enough to have learned when to say nothing and let the good things be what they are. Nora braided Ruth's hair that morning, with the serious concentration she brought to every task she undertook. She did it twice before she was satisfied. Then she stepped back, and looked at what she had done, and nodded once. Precisely, and went downstairs without saying anything more, because she was Nora, and she had always understood that the doing was more important than the talking about the doing. Thomas held the ring. He held it the way he had come to Ruth's kitchen that first week, fully committed. Once the decision had been made, with no remaining reserve about it, he placed it in James's palm at the right moment, and then he stood at his father's side, and looked at Ruth with the direct hazel eyes she had come to love and said nothing. Because Thomas had always known that the things that mattered most did not require words. Lily carried the bread stamp. Lily carried it down the aisle of the yard, between the neighbors' chairs, with the solemnity of someone transporting a sacred object, which to her it was. And she placed it in Ruth's hand at the front of the gathering, with the look of a task accomplished and an accounting satisfied. So you can make the right bread, she said. Yes, Ruth said. She closed her fingers around it. Thank you. Ruth had attempted twice to retrieve it, and failed both times.
and had eventually accepted that the bread stamp would make its way back to her apron pocket in its own time, and by its own route, and that Lily's custody of it in the meantime was not a difficulty, but an act of love, being carried out in the only language available to a 4-year-old who had not yet learned that love had to be restrained to be appropriate. Lily took her place beside her sister. Satisfied, the minister spoke. Ruth said her vows in a voice that carried clearly over the yard, and out across the 80 acres and into the enormous November sky above them. She did not cry. She had made no such determination ahead of time. Had made no promises to herself about what she would or would not feel. Standing in her own yard, on her own land, saying true things. In front of the people she had found her way toward through the longest 2 years and 4 months of her life. She had simply arrived at the moment. And it was not a moment that required crying, it was a moment that required standing fully inside it and letting it be entirely what it was.
She did that.
When it was done, Amos was not crying either. Which was also not something either of them would have acknowledged. James Harlan took both of Ruth's hands in his, and held them, and looked at her with the same directness he had always looked at her with. The look that had no management in it and no performance, and nothing working toward any outcome except the simple honest fact of her standing in front of him. He leaned close and said, very quietly, for her alone, "The bread told you everything," he said. I was paying attention.
She looked at him. She looked at the yard and the sky and the 80 acres, and the house behind her, with the sourdough starter on the shelf and her mother's cast iron on the hook, and her deed in the drawer, and every version of herself she had ever been alive in the particular way they are alive when you have finally arrived somewhere true. She looked at Nora, composed and certain, standing beside her sister, who was still holding one hand slightly out from her body, in the formal manner of a child who has just completed an important duty. She looked at Thomas, standing straight and steady at his father's side, with his father's eyes. She looked at Lily, who was looking back at her with the full, uncomplicated attention of a child who had already known how this would go and was simply waiting for the adults to arrive at it. Ruth Calloway. Ruth Harlan smiled, not the managed kind, not the polite kind, the real kind, which she had not had occasion to produce in a long time, and which turned out, when she finally let it, to feel exactly like coming home.
She knew it now, one loaf at a time. She had told herself through the worst of it, one loaf at a time. She had not known then that it was also how you built a life. That patience and intention and the willingness to stay in the work past the point where it was comfortable, were the same whether you were making bread or making something larger and more lasting and more worth the making. The Cattlemen's Association winter dinner was held in January in Laramie. 60 tables. Ruth's name on the program. Printed plain and clear, Ruth Calloway Harlan, Holt County. She drove down from the ranch with Amos, who was delivering supply that week anyway, and said it was no trouble, which meant he would not have missed it for the considerable world. James stayed at the ranch with the children, because 60 tables of cattlemen was not an occasion requiring a husband's presence, and Ruth had told him so directly and he had agreed without any argument because he was the kind of man who understood the difference between support and company and knew which one she needed. She set up the kitchen at the Laramie Hall at 4 in the morning. She unpacked her knives. She took out her mother's cast iron. She put her starter on the counter and let it come to temperature. She reached into her apron pocket and closed her fingers around the tin bread stamp. The hall was dark and quiet and enormous. 60 empty tables waiting for the day and the people who would fill them. And Ruth stood alone in the kitchen at 4 in the morning, and she breathed, and she let it settle, and she felt what she felt. Every time she stood in a kitchen at the start of a long day with the work ahead of her, and her hands ready for it. She felt like herself. She pressed the stamp into the first loaf,
Then the second. Then the third.
one loaf at a time. Outside, the January dark was beginning, barely, to give way at its edges to the first suggestion of a morning that was coming, regardless of anything, as mornings always came patient, indifferent, belonging to whoever was awake to receive it. Ruth Calloway Harlan was awake.